I never thought I'd be the type of person to destroy a family member's life. But here I am, sitting in my car outside a courthouse, watching my Uncle Derek get handcuffed and led away in an orange jumpsuit. 6 months ago, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're just a niece, Madison." The money stays with family that matters. What he didn't know was that Grandpa Charles had already given me the one thing that would destroy him completely. Let me back up and tell you how a sweet old man's final gift turned into the most savage revenge story you'll ever hear. My name is Madison Torres, and until recently, I was just another broke 28-year-old nurse working double shifts to pay rent and help my mom with her medical bills. I drive a 10-year-old Honda with a cracked windshield, shop at discount grocery stores, and haven't taken a real vacation in 3 years. The most expensive thing I owned was my grandfather's vintage watch, which he gave me on my 18th birthday. I'm not the kind of person who usually fights for money or gets involved in family drama. I'm the peacekeeper, the one who brings potato salad to every gathering and changes the subject when arguments start. But this story isn't really about me. It's about my grandfather, Charles Morrison, who died 3 months ago at 79 years old, leaving behind a fortune that nobody in our family even knew existed. Grandpa Charles was the kind of man who wore the same flannel shirts for 20 years and drove a pickup truck until the wheels fell off. So when we found out he was worth $6.8 million, we were all shocked. He'd built Morrison Construction from nothing, starting with a hammer and a toolbox in 1965. And by the time he retired, his company had built half the commercial buildings in our county. Then there's my Uncle Derek, my dad's older brother, who's 52, and has always acted like he was born to inherit the world. Derek lives in a McMansion in Seattle, drives luxury cars he can't afford, and runs what he calls a consulting business that seems to consist mainly of asking other people for money. He's the type of guy who shows up to family barbecues wearing a Rolex and talking about his latest business venture while everyone else is trying to figure out how to pay their bills. Derek always made it clear that he was the golden child, the one who would carry on the family legacy, even though he visited Grandpa maybe twice a year, and usually only when he needed something. My dad, Robert, is Derek's complete opposite. He's quiet, hardworking, and runs his own auto repair shop. He never asked Grandpa for anything, never bragged about connections or schemes, and treated his father with genuine respect rather than calculated charm. Dad's been married to my mom, Linda, for 31 years, and they've been dealing with her early onset dementia for the past 5 years. Between her medical bills and the shop's overhead, my parents have been struggling financially, but they've never complained or asked for help. And then there's Grandpa Charles himself, the man at the center of this whole mess. He was tough as nails but had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. Every Sunday for the past 10 years, I drove 3 hours from Portland to his ranch in rural Oregon just to spend the day with him. We'd sit on his porch, drink sweet tea, and he'd tell me stories about building his business from scratch. He taught me how to change oil, how to spot a liar, and how to stand up for myself when people try to walk all over you. The last thing he ever said to me was, "Madison, honey, some people think being family means you owe them something. But real family earns love through actions, not demands. Remember that when things get complicated?" I thought he was just being philosophical. I had no idea he was preparing me for war. What happened after his funeral changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and justice. It's a story about greed, betrayal, and the kind of revenge that's so perfectly executed, it almost feels like divine intervention. Because sometimes, when someone underestimates you and tries to steal everything you care about, the universe hands you exactly the weapon you need to fight back. And trust me, you're going to want to hear every single detail of how this played out. To understand how everything went so wrong, you need to know what our family looked like before greed tore it apart. Picture this. Every Sunday for 10 years, I'd wake up at 6 in the morning, grab a thermos of coffee, and drive 3 hours from my cramped Portland apartment to Grandpa Charles's ranch in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. The drive took me through winding mountain roads, past forests that seemed to stretch forever, until I'd finally see the wooden sign that read, Morrison Ranch, established 1967. My life back then was pretty simple and honestly, pretty exhausting. I worked as a registered nurse at Portland General Hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts that left me dead on my feet. Between my salary and the occasional overtime, I was making about $52,000 a year, which sounds decent until you factor in Portland rent, student loans, and the fact that I was helping my parents cover my mom's medical expenses. Linda, my mom, had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia when she was only 57, and watching her slowly forget pieces of herself was heartbreaking for all of us. My dad, Robert, tried to carry the financial burden alone, but his auto repair shop wasn't exactly a gold mine. He's the most honest mechanic you'll ever meet, which unfortunately means he's also the poorest. While other shops in town were overcharging customers and doing unnecessary repairs, Dad would actually tell people when their car was fine and save them money. Noble? Absolutely. Profitable? Not so much. That's why those Sunday visits with Grandpa meant everything to me. His ranch wasn't fancy, just a modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch surrounded by 60 acres of pasture where he kept a few horses and cattle. But it felt like stepping into a different world where time moved slower and problems seemed smaller. Grandpa would always have a pot of coffee ready and whatever project he was working on that week. Sometimes we'd fix fence posts. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch and watch the horses graze while he told me stories about the old days. "You know, Madison," he'd say, rocking back in his chair, "I built Morrison Construction with these 2 hands and a borrowed pickup truck. Started in 1965 with nothing but determination and a willingness to outwork everyone else. By the time I sold it in 2010, we'd built half the commercial buildings in 3 counties. But the real secret wasn't the work ethic. It was knowing who to trust and who to watch carefully. He'd always slip me an envelope before I left, usually with $200 or $300 inside. For gas money," he'd say with a wink, even though we both knew gas didn't cost that much. "And maybe grab something nice for your mom. She's been through enough." It wasn't just the money that mattered, though. It was the fact that he saw how hard I was working, how much I was sacrificing, and he wanted to help without making me feel like a charity case. The contrast with Uncle Derek couldn't have been starker. Derek would roll up to family gatherings in whatever luxury car he was leasing that month, wearing expensive suits and talking about his latest business venture. He ran something called Morrison Consulting Services, which, as far as I could tell, involved convincing people to invest in projects that never quite materialized. He'd show up maybe twice a year, always with some story about how his consulting business was about to take off, and usually with his hand out asking Grandpa for another loan. "Derek's got big dreams," Grandpa would tell me after these visits, but there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Sometimes I wonder if he's dreaming so big he's forgotten to look at what's right in front of him. What I didn't realize at the time was that Grandpa was already seeing warning signs. 3 months before he passed away, during what would be our last Sunday dinner together, he pulled me aside in the kitchen while Dad was loading the dishwasher. "Madison, honey, I need you to remember something important," he said, his voice more serious than I'd ever heard it. "Derek thinks he's clever, but I've been reading bank statements and watching people for 60 years. Some lessons need to be learned the hard way, and some people need to be taught that family loyalty isn't just about blood, it's about character." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was just being philosophical, maybe worrying about Derek's spending habits or his tendency to treat family like an ATM. But looking back, I realized that Grandpa had already figured out exactly who Derek really was, and he was preparing me for the war that was coming. Grandpa Charles passed away on a Tuesday morning in February, and by Thursday, Derek had already started making moves that should have been my first red flag. I was still in that foggy, heartbroken state where you can barely function, let alone think strategically. But Derek was operating like a man with a plan. The funeral was held at Riverside Memorial Chapel, the same place where we'd said goodbye to Grandma 15 years earlier. The whole service felt surreal. I kept expecting Grandpa to walk through the doors and tell us this was all some elaborate joke. Instead, I watched Derek work the room like he was campaigning for office, shaking hands with Grandpa's old business associates and making sure everyone knew he was handling all the arrangements. After the service, Derek pulled Dad and me aside in the chapel's parking lot. "Listen, I know this is hard for everyone," he said, putting on his most sincere voice. But Dad always told me that when something happened to him, I should step up as the oldest son and take care of the family business. He made me the executor of his estate, and I want you both to know I'm going to make sure everyone gets what they deserve. That phrase, what they deserve, stuck with me. There was something about the way he said it that didn't sit right, but I was too grief-stricken to analyze it properly. A week later, Derek called and asked us to come to his house in Seattle for a family meeting about the will. I thought it would be more comfortable and private than some stuffy lawyer's office, he explained. We can handle this like families should, without all the legal formalities. Dad seemed relieved about avoiding lawyers, but something in my gut told me this wasn't how these things usually worked. Derek's house was everything you'd expect from someone trying too hard to look successful. Marble counters, leather furniture, and a dining room table that probably cost more than my car. He had papers spread out like he was conducting serious business, and he'd even put out coffee and pastries, like this was some kind of celebration. "All right, family," Derek said, settling into his chair with the confidence of someone who'd already won. "I've gone through all of Dad's documents, and I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Dad was more successful than any of us realized. The bad news is that most of his wealth was tied up in investments and properties that need careful management." He slid a handwritten document across the table. "This is Dad's will. He kept it simple, the way he liked everything. He left the bulk of the estate to me, with instructions to take care of the family as I see fit." Derek's voice had that practiced smoothness of someone who'd rehearsed this speech. "Robert, he's left you $25,000 to help with Linda's medical expenses. Madison, there's $15,000 for you, which should help with your student loans." I stared at the paper, trying to process what I was reading. It looked like it had been written in a hurry, and something about the handwriting seemed off, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. More importantly, this didn't sound like Grandpa at all. He was methodical about everything, especially important decisions. The idea that he'd leave a handwritten will, when he was meticulous about documenting everything else in his life, seemed completely out of character. "Wait," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Derek, this doesn't mention the ranch at all. Grandpa always talked about wanting to keep it in the family. And what about his specific wishes? He had strong opinions about how he wanted things handled." Derek's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but I caught it. For just a second, his confident mask slipped, and I saw something cold underneath. "Madison, sweetheart, you have to understand how these things work. Dad knew that managing this kind of wealth requires experience and business sense. He trusted me to make the right decisions for everyone." Dad, who'd been quiet through the whole presentation, finally spoke up. "Derek, are you sure this is what he wanted? It seems like a lot of responsibility for one person." "Robert, Dad and I talked about this extensively before he passed," Derek replied, his tone becoming slightly sharper. "He was very clear that he wanted the family legacy to stay with someone who understood business. You're a good man, but let's be honest, you fix cars. This requires someone who understands investments, tax implications, and wealth management." That's when Derek made his first real mistake. He looked directly at me and said, "Listen, Madison, I know you were close to Dad, and that's sweet, but at the end of the day, you're just a niece. The real family decisions need to be made by his sons, and frankly, I'm the only one qualified to handle something this complex." Just a niece. Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 10 years driving 6 hours every Sunday to spend time with a man who supposedly saw me as just a niece. I thought about all those conversations on the porch, all the times he'd told me I had more heart than anyone else in the family, all the quiet moments when he'd treated me like I was the most important person in his world. Something was very, very wrong here. That night, I sat in my car outside Derek's house for 20 minutes before I could even start the engine. Just a niece. The words kept echoing in my head, and with each repetition, my grief was slowly being replaced by something else. Anger, determination, and for the first time since Grandpa's funeral, absolute clarity. I drove back to Portland in silence, but my mind was racing. Everything about that meeting felt wrong. The handwritten will, the informal setting, Derek's rush to handle everything himself, and most importantly, the way he'd dismiss me like I was some distant relative instead of the granddaughter who'd spent every Sunday with Grandpa for 10 years. Back in my apartment, I pulled out every photo I had of Grandpa and me. There we were at the ranch, fixing fence posts. There we were on the porch, him teaching me how to read financial statements because every woman should understand money. And there we were last Christmas, when he'd given me his vintage watch and said, "This belonged to my father, and someday it'll belong to someone who understands what family really means." That's when I remembered something crucial. About 18 months ago, Grandpa had mentioned hiring a lawyer. "Getting my affairs in order," he'd said casually. "Found myself a sharp attorney named Samuel Harrison. Reminds me of myself when I was younger, except he actually went to law school." He'd laughed at his own joke, but he'd been serious about the lawyer. At 7 in the morning, I was on the phone with Harrison and Associates. The receptionist told me Mr. Harrison was in court, but she could schedule an appointment for later that week. "Actually," I said, "this is regarding the Charles Morrison estate. I believe Mr. Harrison was his attorney." There was a pause. "Hold please, Miss Morrison. Mr. Harrison specifically asked to be notified immediately if anyone from the Morrison family called." Within 2 minutes, Samuel Harrison himself was on the line. "Madison Torres? Charles Morrison's granddaughter?" His voice was sharp, professional, but I could hear something else underneath. Relief, maybe, or excitement. "Yes, sir. I was hoping to speak with you about my grandfather's will. There's been a family meeting and some things don't seem right." "Miss Torres, I need you to come to my office today. Can you be here by noon?" The drive to Harrison's office felt like the longest hour of my life. His building was downtown, glass and steel, the kind of place that charges by the minute. When I walked into his office, Samuel Harrison looked exactly like what you'd expect from someone Grandpa would hire, 60s, gray-haired, wearing a suit that had seen better days but was still perfectly pressed. He had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. "Miss Torres," he said, standing to shake my hand, "your grandfather talked about you constantly. Said you were the only one in the family with any sense." He gestured to a chair across from his massive oak desk. "Now, tell me about this family meeting." I laid out everything. Derek's immediate takeover, the handwritten will, the suspicious amounts, the dismissive treatment. Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Torres, I have some news that might interest you." He opened a thick folder on his desk. "Your grandfather did indeed have a will, a proper one, drafted by this office, witnessed, notarized, and filed appropriately, and it looks nothing like what your uncle described." My heart started pounding. "What does it say?" "The estate is to be divided equally between his 2 sons, Robert and Derek Morrison. You, Madison Torres, are to receive the ranch property and a $500,000, specifically because," and I quote, "Madison has shown more loyalty and character than anyone else in this family, and she deserves to be rewarded for her devotion." I felt like I might faint, but Derek said, "Derek has committed fraud, Miss Torres. What's more, your grandfather suspected he might try something like this." Harrison pulled out another folder. "6 months ago, Charles Morrison gave me power of attorney and access to monitor all his accounts. He was concerned about some irregularities he'd noticed in his bank statements." "What kind of irregularities?" Harrison's smile was grim. "It appears Derek had been helping himself to your grandfather's money well before Charles passed away. We've been building a case, and frankly, we've been waiting for Derek to make his move so we could catch him red-handed." I stared at him, trying to process everything. "So what do we do now?" "Now, Miss Torres, we set a trap. Your grandfather was a smart man who planned for this exact scenario. Are you willing to help us give Derek exactly what he deserves?" For the first time in a week, I smiled. "Mr. Harrison, I think Grandpa would want me to fight smart, not hard." "What did you have in mind?" "First, we're going to let Derek think he's won. Then we're going to document every lie he tells and every illegal move he makes. And finally, we're going to introduce him to the concept of consequences." I thought about Grandpa's watch on my wrist, about his words on the porch, about the way Derek had looked at me like I was nothing. When do we start? 2 weeks later, I called Derek and delivered the performance of my life. Uncle Derek, I said, letting my voice sound defeated and exhausted. I've been thinking about everything you said, and you're right. I don't understand business like you do, and maybe I was being emotional about Grandpa's decisions. Could we meet one more time? I'd like to sign whatever papers I need to sign to release any claim to the estate. I just want this to be over. I could practically hear Derek smiling through the phone. Madison, sweetheart, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. Of course we can meet. Why don't you come to the house Saturday afternoon? I'll have all the paperwork ready. Actually, I said, playing my first card, would it be okay if I brought a lawyer? I know it seems silly for such a small amount, but my friend at the hospital said I should have someone look over anything I sign, just to protect myself. Derek paused for just a moment. Of course, of course. Bring whoever makes you comfortable. We're family, after all. Saturday arrived with the kind of gray, drizzly Seattle weather that matched my mood perfectly. I drove to Derek's house with Samuel Harrison following in his own car. We'd rehearsed this meeting 3 times, and Harrison had coached me on staying calm no matter what Derek said. The goal, he'd reminded me, is to let him hang himself with his own rope. Derek answered the door wearing his most magnanimous smile, the kind he usually reserved for potential investors. Madison, and you must be her attorney, Derek Morrison, he said, extending his hand to Harrison with the confident grip of someone who thought he was about to close the easiest deal of his life. Samuel Harrison, came the reply, and I caught the slight tightening around Derek's eyes as he recognized the name, but he recovered quickly. Well, let's get this taken care of, Derek said, leading us to his dining room where he'd spread out several official-looking documents. Madison, I've prepared a simple release form that acknowledges you've received your inheritance according to your grandfather's wishes. Just sign here, and we can put this whole unpleasant business behind us. I picked up the pen, then hesitated. Derek, before I sign, could you just explain one more time how Grandpa wanted things distributed? I want to make sure I understand. Derek settled back in his chair, radiating confidence. Of course, sweetheart. Dad was very clear that he wanted the family wealth to stay with his sons. Since we understood the business world better, he left you $15,000, which is generous for a grandchild, and Robert got $25,000 to help with Linda's care. The rest stays with me to manage for the family's long-term benefit. And the ranch? I asked. The ranch will be sold, and the proceeds will go into the family trust that I'll be managing, Derek said smoothly. Dad knew that maintaining a property like that is expensive and complicated. Harrison, who had been sitting quietly with his briefcase on his lap, finally spoke. Mr. Morrison, that's a very interesting interpretation of your father's wishes. Derek's smile faltered slightly. I'm sorry, what do you mean? Well, Harrison said, opening his briefcase with deliberate slowness, I'm actually not Miss Torres's attorney. I'm your father's attorney. Charles Morrison hired me 18 months ago to draft his will and handle his estate planning. The color drained from Derek's face so quickly I thought he might faint. That's impossible. Dad never mentioned hiring a lawyer. Harrison pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. Oh, but he did. In fact, he was quite specific about his concerns regarding potential estate fraud. He asked me to monitor his accounts and be prepared for exactly this scenario. Harrison's voice was calm, professional, and absolutely devastating. This is the real will, Mr. Morrison, properly witnessed and notarized. Would you like me to read the relevant sections? Derek's hands were shaking now. I don't understand. Dad gave me that will himself. He wrote it in his own handwriting. Actually, Mr. Morrison, we've had a handwriting expert analyze your father's signature on various documents over the past 6 months. What you presented to your family appears to be a rather poor forgery. Harrison opened the folder. But that's not even the most interesting part. I watched Derek's face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when the man who'd called me just a niece realized that his victim had outplayed him completely. You see, Harrison continued, your father suspected you'd been accessing his accounts without permission. We've been building a criminal case against you for the past 6 months. Your little performance 2 weeks ago was simply the final piece of evidence we needed." Derek looked at me with something between shock and rage. "Madison, you don't understand what you're doing. This will destroy the family." I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in years. "No, Derek, you already did that when you decided I was just a niece." Derek lost his house, his BMW, and faced 2 years in prison. Robert used his inheritance to start his own auto repair shop and pay for Linda's medical care. Madison kept the ranch and used her inheritance to open a free clinic in her grandfather's memory. The experience taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones willing to hurt you the deepest. But it also showed me that good people, like Grandpa Charles, protect the ones they love even after they're gone. Robert and Madison grew closer through the ordeal, and Linda had moments of clarity where she understood her father-in-law had saved their family's future. Derek's wife divorced him and apologized to the family for not seeing the signs earlier. Grandpa Charles used to say, "Money doesn't change people, it reveals who they always were." Derek showed his true colors, but so did everyone else. The greedy got justice, the kind got protection, and the loyal got rewarded. Every Sunday, I drive out to Grandpa's ranch and sit on the porch where we used to talk. I can almost hear him laughing and saying, "I told you Derek wasn't as smart as he thought." The money was nice, but knowing that love and loyalty win in the end, that was the real inheritance he left me. If you've ever dealt with family betrayal or financial manipulation, share your story in the comments. Sometimes knowing you're not alone is the first step to finding your strength.